My name is Everett Holloway, and I just lived through 90 days of hell on Earth. When the crimson rain first fell, I was working search and rescue at Mount Mitchell. That downpour changed everything. The infection spread fast. Cities fell. The people I tried to save turned into monsters. My wilderness skills kept me and 23 others alive while the world collapsed around us. This is how a mountain rescue expert survived the first 3 months of the apocalypse. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Everett Holloway, but most folks around these parts just call me Switchback. For the past 12 years, I've worked as the search and rescue coordinator at Mount Mitchell State Park in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. Before all this happened, my job was to find lost hikers, rescue injured climbers, and occasionally recover the bodies of those who underestimated these mountains. I grew up in these hills, half Cherokee on my mother's side. She taught me how to read the land, how to find water, how to know which plants heal and which ones kill. My father was a park ranger who taught me how to track, how to navigate by stars, and how to survive when things go wrong. I guess you could say I was training for the apocalypse my whole life without knowing it. That morning, October 15th, started like any other autumn day in the mountains. The leaves were at peak color, tourists crowding the observation decks with their cameras. I was checking our emergency equipment at the ranger station when the first reports came in. Strange red precipitation falling in Georgia, then Tennessee. The meteorologists were baffled, calling it some kind of mineral dust from a storm system. Nothing to worry about, they said. I remember Ranger Dawson laughing about it. Red rain? Sounds like something from those science fiction novels you're always reading, Switchback. I laughed too. We all did. Why wouldn't we? The world hadn't ended before. By midday, the sky had taken on a strange copper tint. The tourists noticed it too, pointing and taking pictures. Some of them asked me if a storm was coming. I checked the radar. Nothing showing except some scattered precipitation heading our way from the southwest. Probably just a light shower, I told them. Mountain weather changes quick, but nothing dangerous on the radar. I was wrong. So wrong. The radio crackled around 2 in the afternoon. It was Darlene at the visitor center, voice tight with concern. Everett, you seeing this? The rain's coming down, but it's red. Actual red droplets? I stepped outside and saw it for myself. The rain falling from the copper sky wasn't normal. Each droplet had a distinct crimson color, like diluted blood. It stained everything it touched. The wooden railings, the stone paths, even the skin on my hand when I held it out. The drops felt thicker than water, almost oily, and carried a faint metallic smell. My first thought wasn't about the end of the world. It was about the hikers still on the trails. We had at least 30 people logged on the mountain that day, most of them day hikers, but a few planning overnight stays at the backcountry campsites. I'm going to round up the hikers, I told Darlene through the radio. Tell anyone who comes to the visitor center to stay inside until we know what this is. Dawson grabbed my arm. You're going out in that? Shouldn't you wait to see what's happening? I shook my head. Can't wait. Some of those folks only brought light rain gear, if anything. If this stuff is some kind of chemical or pollution, we need to get them under proper shelter. I didn't wait for permission. I grabbed my pack, always kept ready with first aid supplies, water, emergency rations, navigational tools, and extra clothing, and headed out into the crimson downpour. The rain soaked through my jacket within minutes, leaving red stains across the fabric. I found the first group of hikers about a mile up the trail. A family of 4 huddled under a small rock outcropping, the children crying as the red rain stained their clothes and skin. Follow me, I told them. We need to get back to the visitor center. The father nodded gratefully, gathering his family. As we walked, I noticed red welts forming on his exposed neck where the rain had hit him directly. This pattern repeated as I found more hikers. Confusion, fear, and those strange welts forming on exposed skin. By evening, I'd guided 17 people back to the station. 3 groups were still unaccounted for. That's when the first reports started coming in through the emergency broadcast system. The red rain wasn't just falling in the Appalachians. It was across most of the eastern seaboard, and people exposed to it were getting sick. Fever, disorientation, and those red welts that hardened over time. The satellite phone rang. It was regional headquarters ordering an immediate evacuation of all park personnel and visitors. "There's a situation developing," my supervisor said, his voice tight. "CDC is involved. Get everyone out and report to the Emergency Management Center in Asheville." But the evacuation never fully happened. As night fell, the roads began to clog with panicked travelers. Then the power went out. Our backup generator kicked in, giving us access to radio communications and emergency lighting. The news got worse by the hour. Atlanta was in chaos. Reports of infected individuals attacking others in hospitals, military checkpoints being established, then Charlotte, then Knoxville, cities falling like dominoes. By morning, the red rain had stopped, but the damage was done. The first of our evacuees began showing symptoms, those who had been most exposed. The hardening welts, high fever, confusion. Within hours, they became aggressive, attacking anyone nearby. We had to lock them in the storage shed behind the visitor center. I carry the burn scars on my right arm and neck from a wildfire rescue gone wrong 5 years ago. 3 hikers trapped on a ridge with the fire closing in. I reached 2 of them, but the third, a teenage girl, was just beyond my grasp when the wind shifted. Sometimes I still wake up hearing her screams. I swore I'd never fail like that again, never leave anyone behind if I could help it. But now, looking at those infected in the shed, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake bringing these people back. Maybe they'd have been better off in the wilderness, away from others they could infect. The radios kept working for another day. We learned the infection spread through direct contact with the rain or with bodily fluids from the infected. It progressed quickly, 24 to 48 hours from exposure to full transformation. The infected didn't seem like people anymore. They became something else entirely, driven by rage and hunger. By the 3rd day, we realized no help was coming. The government was overwhelmed, focusing resources on major population centers. Those of us in remote areas were on our own. That's when I made the decision that would define the next months of our survival. "We can't stay here," I told the remaining healthy staff and visitors. "The infected will break out eventually, and more might come from the towns below. We need to go deeper into the mountains." The days after the red rain were a blur of horror and difficult decisions. We watched helplessly as the infected changed before our eyes. The hardening red welts spread across their skin like a shell, almost like a fungal growth consuming them from the outside in. Their eyes clouded over with a reddish film, and they lost the ability to speak in coherent sentences, reduced to grunts and screams. What frightened me most was how the infection changed their behavior. I watched a mother who had been desperate to protect her children just hours before trying to attack those same children when the infection took hold. It was as if everything that made her human, her memories, her love, her consciousness, had been erased and replaced with pure aggression. One infected man, a high school science teacher from Charlotte who had been hiking with his wife, broke free from our improvised containment. He attacked 3 people before we could restrain him again. His strength was unnatural, far beyond what his frame should have allowed. His wife was among those bitten. She began showing symptoms within hours, much faster than those infected by the rain directly. That's when we realized the infection could spread through bodily fluids, not just through direct exposure to the crimson rain. One bite, one scratch where the skin was broken, that was all it took. The incubation period was shorter from direct contact with an infected too. The rain-exposed took up to 2 days to turn. The bitten took as little as 6 hours. I used our satellite phone to call emergency services while it still worked. The lines were jammed, but I finally got through to someone at FEMA. What they told me made my blood run cold. The situation wasn't contained to our region. The red rain had fallen across most of the eastern United States, parts of Canada, and there were reports of similar precipitation in Europe and Asia. "What's causing it?" I asked. The operator didn't know. Some were saying chemical warfare, others a meteorological phenomenon that had picked up some kind of pathogen. Scientists were working on it, they said, but their priority now was containment. Containment became a laughable concept by the end of the first week. The last broadcast we received before the power grid failed completely described Atlanta as overrun. The terminology shifted from sick individuals to infected. The military had established quarantine zones around major cities, but they were failing one by one. I remember the last clear transmission we received. A CDC official, voice tight with barely controlled panic. The infection appears to target the limbic system and frontal lobe. Subjects maintain basic motor function but lose higher cognitive abilities. They display pack behavior and are drawn to uninfected humans. Avoid contact at all costs. There is no known cure. Then, nothing but static. The infected in our storage shed broke out during the night. 5 of them moving with that unnerving coordination they develop. They killed 2 of our group before we could respond. I had to make the hardest decision of my life. To use lethal force against people who, just days ago, had been asking me which trail had the best views. It wasn't a fight I care to remember in detail. What stays with me is how the infected didn't react to pain. Wounds that would have incapacitated a normal person barely slowed them down. Only catastrophic damage to the head seemed to stop them permanently. After we dealt with the immediate threat, I gathered the survivors. We had 19 people left, a mix of park staff and visitors. Some were still in shock, others angry, all terrified. I told them the truth. No one was coming to save us. If we wanted to live, we needed to move deeper into the mountains, away from population centers where the infection would spread fastest. Not everyone agreed. 4 people decided to try reaching their families in nearby towns. I gave them supplies and directions, but warned them of the risks. None of them ever returned. Sometimes I wonder if they made it, or if they joined the ranks of the infected. The 15 who stayed with me, that was the beginning of our survivor group. Ranger Dawson, who I mentioned earlier, Elena, a nursing student who had been hiking with her boyfriend, the Marshall family, father, mother, and their teenage son, a retired couple from Florida, 2 college students, a doctor on vacation from Chicago, 3 local hikers who knew these mountains almost as well as I did, and me, the search and rescue coordinator who suddenly found himself leading people through an apocalypse. We packed everything useful from the visitor center and ranger station: first aid supplies, non-perishable food, tools, maps, batteries, flashlights, 2 hunting rifles and ammunition, water purification tablets, the basics of survival. I made everyone change their clothes, throwing away anything stained with the crimson rain, just to be safe. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something odd about the infected we'd dealt with. They seemed sluggish, slower than they had been during the initial outbreak. The temperature had dropped overnight, with frost forming on the ground. It was just an observation then, but it would prove crucially important later. We set out before dawn, taking lesser-known trails to avoid potential encounters. I led us higher into the mountains, away from the main roads and tourist areas. My plan was to reach one of the more remote fire observation towers. Defensible positions with good visibility, usually stocked with some emergency supplies. Our journey took us through Ghost Creek Valley, named for the mist that constantly hangs between the trees. It's easy to get disoriented there if you don't know the landmarks. As we picked our way through, Elena pointed out something disturbing. The wildlife was behaving strangely. Birds were silent. We found a deer carcass covered in red fungal growth, similar to what we'd seen on the infected. "The ecosystem is being affected too," she whispered. "Whatever this is, it's not just targeting humans." That night, we made camp in a cave I knew from previous rescue operations. As everyone settled in, I took first watch, staring out at the unnaturally quiet forest. In the dim moonlight, I noticed patches of red growth on some of the trees nearest to our position, the same fungal-like substance from the infected. It seemed to be spreading beyond its hosts, establishing itself in the environment. I didn't tell the others what I'd seen. They were scared enough already. But I made a mental note to avoid any vegetation showing signs of the red growth. If the infection could spread to plants and animals, our food sources would become increasingly limited. The next morning, we heard distant screams echoing through the valley, human screams that gradually transformed into something inhuman. We moved faster after that, everyone understanding without me having to explain what those sounds meant. Charlotte fell 3 days into our journey. We wouldn't have known except for a battery-powered radio one of the college students had brought. The emergency broadcast described street-by-street fighting, then hospital overruns, then silence. Just like Atlanta before it. Just like what would happen to every major city within range of the Crimson Rain. By the time we reached the halfway point to our destination, Knoxville was gone too. The infection was spreading faster than anyone could have predicted, each new infected creating more in a cascading effect. Civilization was unraveling in real time, and we were witnessing it from our mountain vantage point. "You think it's like this everywhere?" Dawson asked me as we watched distant fires burning in what was once a small town in the valley below. The whole world? I didn't have an answer then. All I knew was that our immediate survival depended on reaching the fire tower before our supplies ran too low or we encountered something we couldn't handle. We reached the Higgins Ridge Fire Tower on the 7th day after the Crimson Rain. It stood like a sentinel above the tree line, a steel and wood structure rising 60 feet into the air. I had chosen this location carefully, remote enough to avoid casual discovery, high enough to spot approaching threats, and sturdy enough to defend if necessary. The tower was abandoned, but intact. The Forest Service maintained these towers even after they'd largely shifted to satellite monitoring for fires. Inside, we found basic supplies, canned food, water purification equipment, some first aid materials, emergency blankets, a hand crank radio, and solar panels that could charge small devices. Not luxury accommodations by any means, but a fortress compared to what we'd left behind. As we settled in, our group dynamic began to take shape. People naturally fell into roles based on their skills and personalities. Elena, the nursing student, became our medical expert by default. Dr. Kiyoshi, the physician from Chicago, should have taken that role, but he was still processing the trauma of what he'd witnessed during the outbreak. For now, he was barely functional, speaking only when spoken to. The Marshall family, Tom, Janet, and their 17-year-old son Kyle, took charge of our food inventory and preparation. Tom had been a restaurant manager before the world ended, and his organizational skills proved invaluable. Ranger Dawson and I handled security and planning. The retired couple, the Hendersons, surprised everyone with their knowledge of gardening and food preservation. The two college students, Zach and Mia, were enthusiastic but inexperienced. They became our general laborers, willing to take on any task needed. The three local hikers, Jesse, Marcus, and Raymond, knew different aspects of wilderness survival. Jesse was an amateur botanist who could identify edible plants. Marcus had hunting experience. Raymond had worked construction and understood how to maintain and improve our shelter. That first night in the tower, we had our first real conflict. The Marshall family wanted to try reaching relatives in Asheville. They argued that the city might have been spared, that evacuations could have happened in time. "I understand wanting to find your family," I told them. "But Asheville is over 60 miles from here through infected territory. The odds of making it there alive are slim, and the odds of finding the city intact are even slimmer." Tom Marshall wasn't convinced. "You don't know that. The broadcasts only confirmed Atlanta and Charlotte. Smaller cities might have been better prepared." I shared what I'd observed in the valley below. Distant fires, abandoned vehicles on the highways we could see from our vantage point, the silence where there should have been the sounds of civilization. But Tom remained stubborn until Dawson intervened. "I have family in Asheville too," he said quietly. "But Switchback is right. Our best chance is to wait, to establish ourselves here, and to gather more information before making any move." The conversation grew heated. Voices were raised. For a moment I thought the Marshalls might leave anyway. Then Kyle, their son, spoke up. "Dad, Mom, I'm scared too. I'm worried about Grandma and Grandpa and everyone else. But I'm more scared of what's out there right now. Let's stay, at least until we know more." His words defused the situation. The Marshalls agreed to stay, at least temporarily. But the incident made it clear that keeping our group together would require more than just providing food and shelter. People needed hope, a sense of purpose, and some feeling of control over their lives. That night, I established our first official watch rotation. 2 people on guard at all times, scanning the surrounding wilderness for any sign of the infected or other survivors. I also began teaching everyone basic survival skills: how to move quietly through the forest, how to read tracks, how to distinguish between normal environmental sounds and potential threats. My Cherokee grandmother used to tell me that survival isn't just about physical needs. "The land will provide what you need if you learn to live with it, not against it," she'd say. I shared this wisdom with the group, explaining that we needed to adapt to our new reality rather than fighting against it. We spent the next few days securing our position. Raymond helped me reinforce the tower's base and create an alarm system using cans and fishing line around the perimeter. Marcus set snares for small game in the surrounding forest. Jesse began cataloging edible plants in the area. Elena and Dr. Kiyoshi organized our medical supplies and created a quarantine protocol in case anyone showed symptoms of infection. On our 10th day at the tower, we had our first encounter with other survivors. Zach spotted them during his watch. 3 figures moving through the forest below, heading in our direction. They didn't move like the infected, but we couldn't be too careful. I took Marcus and Dawson with me to intercept them before they reached the tower. We moved silently through the underbrush using hand signals I'd taught them to communicate without sound. When we got close enough, I saw they were a family: mother, father, and a young daughter, perhaps 9 or 10 years old. They looked exhausted, their clothes torn and dirty, the father limping badly. We revealed ourselves carefully, weapons visible, but not aimed directly at them. The father nearly collapsed when he saw us, pulling his daughter behind him protectively. "We're not infected," he said immediately, voice hoarse. "We've been in the woods since it started. Please, my daughter needs food and my wife needs medicine for her diabetes." Their names were Robert, Susan, and Lily Chen. They had been camping in Great Smoky Mountains National Park when the crimson rain fell. They'd avoided direct exposure by sheltering in their tent, then abandoned their car when the roads became impassable. They'd been moving on foot for days, guided only by a basic hiking map and Robert's Boy Scout training from decades earlier. After checking them for signs of infection, we brought them to the tower. The group was wary at first. New people meant new risks, more mouths to feed. But when Lily smiled shyly at Kyle Marshall, something changed in the atmosphere. Here was a child who had survived the apocalypse, a symbol of hope none of us realized we needed. Susan's diabetes complicated matters. She had insulin, but would eventually run out. Elena and Dr. Kiyoshi conferred about potential natural alternatives that might help manage her condition when modern medicine was no longer available. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it was something. The Chen's arrival forced us to reconsider our long-term planning. With 19 people now in our group, our supplies would deplete faster. We needed to become more self-sufficient, and quickly. I called a group meeting that evening. We've been reactive so far, I told everyone. Now we need to be proactive. Winter is coming, and it will be harsh at this elevation. We need to stockpile food, improve our shelter, and establish regular scouting patterns to understand what's happening in the world around us. Robert Chen, despite his exhaustion, offered valuable suggestions based on his engineering background. The solar panels here are minimal, but we could scavenge more from nearby cabins. With enough power, we could maintain some comforts through winter. Everyone contributed ideas. The Hendersons proposed creating a small greenhouse using plastic sheets. Marcus suggested smoking and preserving meat from his traps. Jesse wanted to create a medicinal herb garden. For the first time since the Crimson Rain, people were looking forward instead of back. As the meeting concluded, I noticed Kyle and Lily whispering together, pointing at something outside the tower window. Following their gaze, I saw a patch of crimson growth on a distant tree, the fungal infection spreading through the forest. I made a mental note to investigate how quickly it was expanding its territory. That night, as I took the midnight watch shift, I listened to the mountain winds and watched distant lightning illuminate the changed world below. I thought about my missing fingers, lost years ago in a climbing accident when I'd taken an unnecessary risk. The mountains had taught me then about respecting their power. Now, they were our sanctuary in a world consumed by a different kind of power, one we still didn't understand. 2 weeks after establishing our base at Higgins Ridge Fire Tower, we had developed a functional system for survival. Each morning began with a group meeting where we assigned daily tasks: water collection, foraging, hunting, tower maintenance, security patrols. We operated like a small, disciplined community, everyone understanding that their role was essential to our collective survival. Water was our first priority. The tower had a basic rainwater collection system, but it wasn't sufficient for 19 people. Raymond and I expanded it, creating additional collection points and a filtering system using charcoal, sand, and cloth layers. We boiled all water before drinking it, unsure if the Crimson Rain had contaminated natural water sources. Food came next. Our initial supplies from the ranger station were dwindling faster than anticipated. Marcus expanded his trapping lines, bringing in rabbits, squirrels, and the occasional wild turkey. Jesse taught everyone how to identify safe mushrooms, berries, and edible roots. The Hendersons began cultivating hardy vegetables in containers, using seeds they found in the tower's emergency supplies. But perhaps our most important system was security. I created a detailed map of our surroundings, identifying potential threat approaches and escape routes. Every day, we sent out scouting parties. Never fewer than 3 people, always armed, always back before dark. They mapped infected movements, noted environmental changes, and searched for useful resources. I insisted everyone learn basic self-defense and how to use weapons, from knives to the hunting rifles we had. Some resisted at first, particularly Dr. Kiyoshi, who took an informal Hippocratic oath to heart. "I became a doctor to heal, not to harm," he told me. "In this world, sometimes you have to do both," I replied. "Knowing how to protect yourself means you'll be alive to help others." He relented eventually, though he never became comfortable with firearms. Instead, he focused on learning how to use his medical knowledge in our resource-limited environment. He and Elena organized an impressive medical station in one corner of the tower, cataloging every supply and researching natural alternatives for when modern medicines ran out. Living in such close quarters created inevitable tensions. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Tempers flared over small issues, snoring at night, disagreements over resource allocation, clashing personalities. I established a simple conflict resolution system. Parties involved would state their concerns, others would offer solutions, and, if necessary, I would make the final decision. Most conflicts resolved themselves without my intervention. People recognized that unity was essential for survival. Still, I kept a careful eye on group dynamics, watching for signs of deeper problems brewing beneath the surface. The first real challenge to our stability came when Zach developed a high fever. Everyone froze when Elena announced his symptoms, all thinking the same thing: infection. We moved him to our quarantine area, a small platform we'd built adjacent to the main tower, and Elena examined him wearing protective gear we'd improvised from rain ponchos and surgical masks. "His symptoms don't match the infection pattern," she reported after a thorough examination. "No red welts, no hardening of the skin. It's likely just a normal virus or bacterial infection." Still, we took no chances. Zach remained in quarantine for 3 days while Elena treated him with antibiotics from our limited supply. The incident highlighted our vulnerability to ordinary illness and injury in a world without hospitals. It also led to our first major rule. Anyone showing any symptoms of illness must report them immediately. No exceptions, no hiding symptoms out of fear or embarrassment. Dr. Kiyoshi backed me on this, explaining how quickly disease could spread in our confined living situation. "In the old world, you could take a sick day and stay home," he told the group. "Here, concealing illness could kill everyone." The Chens integrated well into our community. Robert's engineering background proved invaluable for improving our systems. He devised a more efficient way to smoke meat for preservation and helped Raymond reinforce the tower against the coming winter winds. Susan, despite her health challenges, became our record keeper, maintaining inventories and documenting our daily activities in a journal. Their daughter Lily brought something unexpected: laughter. In the midst of apocalyptic horror, this 9-year-old girl somehow maintained her sense of wonder. She collected interesting rocks, pointed out unusually shaped clouds, and asked endless questions about the natural world. Kyle took her under his wing, teaching her what he knew about forests and wildlife. Watching them together, I was reminded of something my father once told me. The young adapt because they have less to unlearn. Lily had known the old world for only 9 years. Perhaps she would navigate this new one better than any of us. By the end of our first month at the tower, we had established what felt like a sustainable existence. Our food stores were growing, our security protocols were well rehearsed, and we'd even created some comforts. Chairs fashioned from branches and paracord, curtains for privacy, a small library of books found in the tower and brought by group members. But I never let the group become complacent. During every morning meeting, I reminded them of the reality beyond our mountain sanctuary. The infected were still out there, possibly evolving. Other survivor groups might become desperate and hostile as resources dwindled. And winter was approaching, bringing its own deadly challenges. "Always be aware of your surroundings" became my daily mantra. I taught everyone my search and rescue habit of mentally cataloging exits whenever entering a new space. I showed them how to identify natural resources in any environment, which trees indicated water nearby, which rock formations might contain caves for shelter, which plants could provide emergency food or medicine. One evening, while checking our perimeter, I found Marcus staring at the distant valley where a small town had once thrived. Now it lay dark and silent. "Do you think there's anyone left down there?" he asked. "Probably," I answered honestly. "There are survivors scattered everywhere, trying to adapt like we are. Should we try to find them? Bring them here?" It was a question I'd been pondering myself. More people meant more skills, more hands for work. But it also meant more mouths to feed, more personalities to integrate, more potential for conflict. "For now, we focus on securing what we have," I told him. "When winter passes, we can consider expanding our community." What I didn't tell him was that I'd been observing something concerning during my solo scouting trips. The crimson fungal growth was spreading through the forest more rapidly than I'd anticipated. Trees that had been clean a week ago now showed patches of red. Wildlife seemed to avoid these areas, and I did too. My instincts told me this environmental contamination would eventually become a serious problem. That night, I updated my mental map of safe zones and danger areas. The uncontaminated territory was shrinking. Eventually, we might need to relocate, but the tower remained our best option for the coming winter. Moving 19 people through potentially infected territory during the cold months would be a last resort. As I took my watch shift, scanning the darkness with binoculars, I noticed unusual movement at the forest edge about half a mile from our position. Not the stumbling gait of the infected, but something deliberate, cautious. I watched for nearly an hour as shadows moved between trees, never coming closer but never leaving either. I didn't alert the others. No need to cause panic over what might be nothing more than deer or other wildlife. But I made a note to investigate at first light, and I loaded the rifle that normally stayed unloaded during watch. In this new world, vigilance was the price of survival, and I intended to keep our group alive through whatever challenges came next. The mysterious shadows at the forest edge would prove to be the first sign of a threat I hadn't fully anticipated, one that would test our community in ways the infected never could. I took Dawson and Raymond with me at first light to investigate the movement I'd spotted the previous night. We moved silently through the forest, using hand signals to communicate. The ground was damp from overnight condensation, making tracking easier. We found footprints, human footprints, near the tree line where I'd seen the shadows. "At least 3 people," I whispered, examining the tracks. "They circled our perimeter but kept their distance." Dawson frowned. Survivors or scouts for something worse? It was a valid question. In the months since the Crimson Rain, we'd encountered only a handful of uninfected survivors. But we'd observed something concerning about the infected. They were evolving. The earliest infected had been almost mindless, driven by rage and hunger. But recent observations suggested they were developing rudimentary pack behaviors, with some appearing to direct the actions of others. "Let's follow the tracks," I decided, "but we maintain distance. Observation only." The trail led us about 2 miles east, toward a ravine I knew well from previous rescue operations. As we approached, Raymond held up his hand, pointing to a thin wisp of smoke rising through the trees. Someone had a campfire going, which meant either survivors unaware of the danger or something else entirely. We approached cautiously, using the dense undergrowth as cover. In a small clearing by the ravine, we found them. 5 people camped around a dying fire. 3 men, 2 women, all armed with improvised weapons. They wore clean clothes and appeared well-fed, unlike most survivors we'd encountered. "They're organized," Dawson whispered. "Look at how they've set up their camp. Defensive positions, clear sight lines." I nodded, noticing the same things. These weren't desperate refugees. They were a coordinated group with survival training. As we watched, one of the men stood and faced directly toward our hiding spot. "You might as well come out," he called. "We've known you were there for the past 5 minutes." My heart raced. They detected us despite our precautions. I signaled to Dawson and Raymond to stay hidden while I slowly stood, hands visible, rifle slung across my back. "Just passing through," I said calmly. "We don't want trouble." The man who'd spoken was tall with a military bearing, probably former armed forces. "You're from the fire tower," he said. It wasn't a question. "We've been watching your setup for a few days. Pretty impressive." I didn't confirm or deny, just waited silently. In this new world, information was as valuable as ammunition. "Relax," he continued. "If we wanted to attack your group, we would have. We're just assessing potential allies." "Allies against what?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Against them," another man said, stepping forward. "The infected aren't just wandering mindlessly anymore. They're organizing, hunting in coordinated groups, and they're adapting to the cold better than they did initially." This confirmed my own observations. During recent scouting trips, I'd noticed the infected moving differently, setting ambushes, herding uninfected toward dead ends, communicating through grunts and gestures. After some negotiation, I agreed to bring their leader, who introduced himself as Major Dennis Blackwood, back to our tower to discuss potential cooperation. Dawson and Raymond escorted the rest of their group to a meeting point halfway between our positions. Trust was a luxury none of us could afford anymore. At the tower, Blackwood explained his group's background. They were the remnants of a National Guard unit that had been deployed to Atlanta during the initial outbreak. When the city fell, they retreated to the mountains with whatever supplies they could salvage. "We've been moving every few days," he explained to our assembled group. "The infected seem drawn to any location where humans stay too long, almost like they can smell established settlements." His information matched our experiences. Twice in the past week, our scouts had reported infected approaching our perimeter, despite our careful measures to eliminate scent trails and visible signs of habitation. Blackwood had more to share about the infected. "Based on what we've observed, there appear to be different types emerging. The standard infected are what you'd expect: aggressive, not too bright, driven by basic instincts. But there's a second type developing. We call them monitors. They're smarter, faster, and they seem to coordinate the others." Elena leaned forward. "Have you noticed any physical differences between these types? The monitors have more extensive fungal growth, particularly around the head, almost like a crown or headdress of red tendrils. They don't attack immediately. They watch, assess, then direct the other infected." This information sent a chill through the group. We'd been operating on the assumption that the infected were dangerous but predictable. The emergence of a more intelligent variant changed everything about our security protocols. Dr. Kiyoshi, who had been largely quiet since his arrival at the tower, spoke up. "This suggests the fungal pathogen is affecting neural pathways selectively, perhaps even establishing a hive mind of sorts through the fungal network." Blackwood nodded. "That's our working theory. The longer someone remains infected, the more integrated they become into this network. The monitors appear to be individuals who've been infected longest." The implications were terrifying. If the infection was evolving, becoming more intelligent and coordinated, our mountain sanctuary might not remain safe for long. After Blackwood left, promising to maintain contact through regular meetings at neutral locations, I called our core group together to discuss what we'd learned. "We need to understand these infected better," I said. "Their behaviors, weaknesses, patterns. Our survival depends on it." The next day, I organized a special reconnaissance mission. Elena, being the most observant member of our group besides myself, would accompany me to study the infected up close. We selected an observation point overlooking a small valley where infected had been spotted regularly, close enough to observe but with multiple escape routes if detected. What we saw confirmed Blackwood's reports and added disturbing new details. A group of about 15 infected moved through the valley, led by two with the distinctive crown-like fungal growths Blackwood had described. These monitors made sounds different from the others, not just grunts and snarls, but complex patterns of clicks and whistles that seemed to direct the group's movement. More concerning was how they interacted with the environment. The standard infected ignored vegetation, but the monitors would occasionally stop to touch trees and plants, leaving behind small patches of the red fungal substance. It was almost as if they were deliberately spreading the infection through the ecosystem. "They're terraforming," Elena whispered, "changing the environment to suit the fungus." I'd observed something similar during my solo scouting, but seeing it as an organized activity rather than random contamination made it significantly more threatening. The crimson rain had been just the beginning. The infection was now spreading methodically through direct contact. As we watched, one of the monitors suddenly stopped and turned toward our position. Despite being hundreds of yards away and downwind, it seemed to sense our presence. It extended a hand toward us, and all the other infected immediately became alert, scanning the hillside. We retreated without being detected, but the incident confirmed another suspicion. The monitors had enhanced sensory capabilities beyond normal human range. This would make future observation much more dangerous. Back at the tower, we shared our findings and implemented new security protocols. No one would travel alone, even within our established safe zone. Watch shifts were doubled. We began constructing additional defenses, pitfalls along likely approach routes, noise traps to alert us to movement, and emergency evacuation plans for worst-case scenarios. The temperature was dropping steadily as November progressed. The first snow dusted the higher elevations, and morning frost became common. Based on our observations of the infected's reduced mobility in cold conditions, winter should have made us safer. But the emergence of the monitors and their apparent adaptation to lower temperatures suggested our cold weather advantage might be temporary. That night, as a harsh wind blew across the ridge, I studied our maps by lamplight, identifying potential fallback positions if the tower was compromised. My fingers traced routes through the mountains, mentally cataloging caves, abandoned structures, and natural barriers that might offer protection. The missing fingers on my left hand, a reminder of past misjudgment, seemed to throb with phantom pain. In my years of mountain rescue, I'd learned that survival often depends not on avoiding danger entirely, but on anticipating it and having contingency plans ready. Now facing an enemy that was literally evolving before our eyes, those lessons had never been more crucial. 2 months into our survival at Higgins Ridge, our initial supplies were dangerously depleted. The tower's emergency stores had been designed to support 2 fire watchers for a season, not 19 people indefinitely. Despite our hunting and foraging efforts, we needed more substantial resources to survive the approaching winter. I organized our first major supply run to an abandoned resort about 7 miles from our position. Intel from Blackwood's group suggested it had been evacuated during the early stages of the outbreak and might still contain valuable supplies. I selected a team of 5 for the mission: myself, Dawson, Marcus, Elena, and, to everyone's surprise, Dr. Kiyoshi, who volunteered unexpectedly. "I was at a similar resort when the crimson rain began," he explained quietly. "I know the layout, where medical supplies would be stored, what to prioritize." We set out at dawn, moving carefully through forest paths to avoid open areas. Each of us carried a backpack for supplies, weapons for defense, and radios to maintain contact with the tower. The journey would take most of the day, with a planned return before nightfall. The forest had changed dramatically since the outbreak. The red fungal growth had spread to nearly 20% of the vegetation, creating eerie crimson patches among the otherwise normal trees. Wildlife avoided these contaminated areas, creating unnatural dead zones of silence in the forest. The spread pattern is systematic, Dr. Kiyoshi observed as we passed a particularly large patch. It's establishing networks like mycelium underground, connecting different areas. About 3 miles from our destination, we encountered our first major obstacle, a ravine where the bridge had collapsed, either from structural failure or deliberate destruction. The detour would add at least 2 hours to our journey. We could climb down and up the other side, Marcus suggested, peering over the edge. It's steep, but manageable with our gear. I studied the ravine carefully. The descent looked straightforward enough, but something felt wrong. My years in search and rescue had taught me to trust my instincts about terrain. Let's check the ravine floor first, I decided. Using binoculars, I scanned the area below. What I saw confirmed my suspicion. Patches of crimson growth covered much of the ravine floor, particularly dense near the water source running through it. "We take the long way around," I announced. "That ravine is heavily contaminated." The detour took us through denser forest, slowing our progress considerably. By midday, we reached the outskirts of the abandoned resort, a sprawling complex of cabins surrounding a central lodge. From our concealed position in the tree line, we observed the area for nearly 30 minutes, watching for any sign of infected or other survivors. The resort appeared deserted, with no movement except fallen leaves blowing across empty pathways. Still, I approached cautiously, dividing our group into 2 teams. Dawson and Marcus would search the outlying cabins while Elena, Dr. Kiyoshi, and I tackled the main lodge. The main building stood eerily quiet, its grand entrance collecting fallen leaves and pine needles. Inside, evidence of hasty evacuation was everywhere. Overturned furniture, abandoned luggage, a guest registry still open at the front desk. But notably absent were bodies or blood, suggesting the evacuation had occurred before the infection reached this area. "Kitchen and pantry first," I directed. "Then medical supplies, tools, and winter clothing." The resort kitchen was a treasure trove. Canned goods, dried foods, cooking oils, and spices that would add much-needed variety to our monotonous diet. We filled our backpacks methodically, prioritizing proteins and high-calorie items. While Elena and I sorted through the kitchen, Dr. Kiyoshi disappeared into the resort's small medical office. He emerged 20 minutes later, his pack bulging with supplies and a rare smile on his face. "Antibiotics, painkillers, bandages, surgical equipment," he reported. "And something unexpected. Insulin. 3 vials, still refrigerated thanks to the backup generator still running on solar power." This was significant news for Susan Chen and her diabetes management. The insulin wouldn't last forever, but it bought us time to develop alternatives. Our radio crackled with Dawson's voice. "Switchback, we found something interesting in cabin 14. You should see this." We secured our findings and moved cautiously to the cabin. Inside, Marcus and Dawson stood over a table covered with papers, hand-drawn maps, notes, and what appeared to be a journal. "Someone was living here until recently," Dawson explained. "Based on the food remains, probably within the last week." I examined the materials. The maps showed detailed observations of infected movements throughout the region, with notations about monitor sightings and behavioral patterns. The journal contained a scientist's methodical observations about the fungal infection, its properties, spread patterns, and physiological effects. "This is incredible," Elena said, flipping through the journal. Whoever wrote this was studying the infection systematically. They've documented evolutionary changes, environmental impacts, even theories about its origin. The last entry was dated just 9 days earlier. Moving north toward the government research station. Signals suggest organized resistance and scientific work continuing there. Must share my findings. This was the first concrete information we'd encountered about any official response still functioning. If government scientists were working on understanding or even countering the infection, finding them could be crucial to long-term survival. We collected everything from the cabin and continued our search of the resort. By mid-afternoon, we had gathered an impressive haul: food for several weeks, medical supplies, tools, winter clothing, batteries, and most importantly, information. As we prepared to leave, Elena noticed something unusual about the resort's swimming pool. Instead of being empty or filled with clear water, it contained a murky, reddish liquid. "Don't go near it," I warned, recognizing the color immediately. "That's not water." The entire Olympic-sized pool had been converted into what appeared to be a cultivation medium for the crimson fungus. The surface rippled occasionally, though there was no wind. "It's growing," Dr. Kiyoshi whispered, "using the pool chemicals and water as nutrients." We backed away slowly. The implications were disturbing. The infection wasn't just spreading passively but actively converting suitable environments for rapid growth. Our return journey became significantly more tense after this discovery. Every patch of red fungus in the forest suddenly seemed more threatening, potentially part of a larger intelligence monitoring our movements. About 2 miles from the tower, Marcus, who was scouting ahead, signaled for us to stop and take cover. Through my binoculars, I saw what had alarmed him: a group of infected on the path ahead, including 2 monitors easily identifiable by their crown-like growths. "They're blocking our direct route," I whispered. "We'll need to circle around." The detour took us dangerously close to the edge of a steep ravine, the same one I had lost 2 fingers on years ago during a climbing accident. The memory of that day flashed vividly: my overconfidence, the unnecessary risk, the moment the rock gave way beneath my grip. This time I moved with deliberate caution, guiding our group along a narrow game trail that skirted the danger zone. We arrived back at the tower just as dusk was settling, our packs heavy with supplies, but our minds heavier with new concerns about the infection's evolution. That evening, as we shared our findings with the rest of the group, Robert Chen studied the scientist's journal with growing interest. According to these notes, the fungal organism operates as a collective intelligence, he explained. The more biomass it converts, whether human, animal, or plant, the more computing power it essentially has. Which explains why the infected are becoming more coordinated and intelligent over time, Elena added. They're not individuals anymore, but nodes in an expanding network. The information brought a new urgency to our situation. If the infection was actively spreading and evolving rather than simply maintaining, our mountain sanctuary wouldn't remain safe indefinitely. We needed better understanding of what we were facing and, potentially, allies with the scientific knowledge to combat it. The government research station mentioned in the journal became our new focus. If it existed, finding it might offer our best hope for long-term survival. But reaching it would mean an extended journey through infected territory, far beyond the relative safety of our established perimeter. That night, I added new information to our maps, plotting potential routes to the north where the research station might be located. As I worked, I couldn't shake the image of the resort swimming pool, transformed into an incubator for the very thing that had destroyed civilization. The infection wasn't just surviving. It was thriving, adapting, and expanding. And we needed to understand it better if we hoped to outlast it. Winter arrived with a vengeance in the Appalachians. By mid-November, we experienced our first serious snowfall, 8 inches overnight, that transformed our mountain terrain into a beautiful but treacherous landscape. The temperature plummeted, frequently dropping below freezing at night. Our fire tower, designed for fair weather observation, became a cold, drafty shelter despite our best efforts at insulation. The harsh conditions created new challenges but also provided unexpected advantages. As we had observed earlier, the infected struggled in cold temperatures. Their movements became sluggish, their coordination impaired. Even the monitors seemed less effective at directing their groups through deep snow. This confirmed our earlier observations about their temperature sensitivity and gave us a temporary reprieve from their encroachment. The fungal organism likely has an optimal temperature range, Dr. Kiyoshi explained during one of our evening meetings. Like most fungi, extreme cold inhibits its metabolic processes. We took advantage of this vulnerability, expanding our secure perimeter and setting up additional observation posts. The snow made tracking easier. Any movement near our position left clear trails that we could monitor. Raymond and I designed snow barriers around the tower base, not just for insulation but as an early warning system. Any disturbance would be immediately visible. But winter brought its own potentially deadly challenges. Keeping warm became our primary concern. The tower had a small wood stove, woefully inadequate for the space and number of people. We operated it continuously, with teams rotating wood-cutting duty to maintain our supply. Everyone slept close together for shared body heat, privacy becoming a luxury we could no longer afford. Food grew scarcer despite our successful resort supply run. Game animals were harder to find in winter conditions, and foraging for plant foods became nearly impossible under the snow. We instituted stricter rationing, reducing portions to extend our supplies. Hunger became a constant companion, a gnawing presence that affected moods and energy levels. About a month into winter, we faced our first medical emergency. Tom Marshall developed a high fever and severe cough, pneumonia, according to Dr. Kiyoshi. In the old world, this would have meant hospitalization and intravenous antibiotics. In our new reality, it became a life-threatening crisis. Elena and Dr. Kiyoshi worked tirelessly, treating Tom with our limited medical supplies. They created a steam tent using hot water and towels to ease his breathing. They administered our precious antibiotics, carefully measuring doses to ensure none was wasted. The rest of us gathered extra firewood to keep the tower warmer and melted snow for drinking water and compresses. For 3 days, Tom hovered between recovery and decline. His wife Janet barely left his side, while their son Kyle took on additional duties to compensate for his father's absence from the work rotation. During this time, I saw our community truly solidify, everyone contributing without being asked, sharing already meager rations to ensure Tom received more nutritious foods, volunteering for extra watches so Elena and Dr. Kiyoshi could focus on treatment. On the 4th day, Tom's fever broke. He wasn't fully recovered, but the worst had passed. The experience left us all shaken, aware of how quickly illness could sweep through our closely quartered group. It also highlighted our vulnerability to common diseases that had been easily treatable before the collapse of civilization. Winter storms isolated us further, sometimes confining everyone to the tower for days at a time. During these periods, tensions occasionally flared. Minor irritations magnified under the pressure of confinement, hunger, and constant fear. I instituted what we called circle talks, regular sessions where everyone could voice concerns in a structured way, with solutions proposed and discussed as a group. The Hendersons proved invaluable during this difficult period. Their lifetime of experience with harsh winters on their Minnesota farm provided practical knowledge about conserving heat, preventing frostbite, and maintaining morale during extended confinement. They organized activities to keep minds occupied, storytelling, simple games using materials we had on hand, teaching useful skills like knot tying and basic tool making. Little Lily Chen managed to find joy even in these harsh conditions. She collected icicles from the tower railings, arranging them by size. She created snow sculptures during brief periods outside. Her resilience reminded us that adaptation was possible, even to this drastically altered world. In late December, during a brief break between storms, I led a small expedition to a nearby cave system I'd explored years earlier during a rescue operation. The caves maintained a constant temperature year-round, cool in summer, but significantly warmer than the outside air in winter. I thought they might serve as an emergency shelter if conditions at the tower became untenable. Raymond, Marcus, and I spent a full day mapping the accessible portions of the cave, identifying chambers large enough to accommodate our group, checking for any signs of contamination or infected presence, and assessing potential security concerns. The caves were clean, though we discovered evidence of animal habitation in some areas, likely creatures seeking the same shelter from winter that we were considering. "This could work," Raymond said as we completed our survey. "Natural water source, defensible entrances, stable temperature. It's not comfortable, but it's survivable." I marked the cave system on our emergency maps, describing multiple approaches and potential hazards. Having this fallback position eased some of my constant anxiety about keeping our group safe. The tower remained our best option, but having alternatives meant we weren't trapped if circumstances changed. As January arrived, we noticed something concerning during our limited scouting expeditions. Despite the cold temperatures, patches of the crimson fungal growth persisted. Some even appeared to be slowly expanding beneath the snow, particularly in areas where the snowpack was thinner or around thermal features like hot springs. "It's adapting," Elena observed during one scouting trip, learning to survive in conditions that initially hindered it. This matched patterns described in the scientist's journal we'd found at the resort. The fungal organism demonstrated remarkable ability to evolve in response to environmental pressures. If it was developing cold tolerance, our winter advantage might prove temporary. One bitterly cold morning in mid-January, Zach spotted unusual movement during his watch shift. Through binoculars, we observed a lone figure trudging through the snow about a mile from our position. The person moved with purpose, not showing the telltale stumbling gait of the infected, but they were clearly struggling in the deep snow. I assembled a small team, myself, Dawson, and Elena, to intercept and assess this potential newcomer. We approached cautiously, using the terrain for cover, aware that this could be a trap. Lone survivors were rare by this point, especially in the harsh winter conditions. As we drew closer, I could see it was a man, heavily bundled against the cold, pulling a makeshift sled loaded with equipment. He collapsed just as we reached him, exhaustion and exposure taking their toll. Elena immediately checked for signs of infection while Dawson and I secured his belongings. The man was in his 50s, bearded and weathered, with the calloused hands of someone accustomed to physical labor. No signs of infection were present, but severe dehydration and early stages of hypothermia threatened his life. We administered emergency field treatment, then transported him back to the tower. His name was Howard Levitt, a Forest Service biologist who had been conducting research at a remote station when the crimson rain fell. He had survived alone for months by relocating to increasingly isolated areas as the infection spread, gathering data and observations along the way. Once recovered enough to speak, Howard confirmed what we had begun to suspect from our own observations and the journal we'd found. The fungal infection was part of a complex organism with apparent intelligence and purpose. "It's not just spreading randomly," he explained, voice still weak from his ordeal. "It's creating a network, terraforming the environment to support its expanded consciousness. The infected humans are just mobile nodes in this network, the most visible part of something much larger and more complex." Howard had been documenting the spread patterns, trying to understand the organism's ultimate goal. His research had led him to seek out other scientists who might be continuing work at government facilities. He had heard the same rumors about a research station to the north that had been mentioned in the journal we found. They're working on a treatment, possibly even a way to reverse early-stage infection, he told us. But communication is limited to occasional encrypted radio bursts. I've been trying to triangulate the signal source. His arrival brought new expertise to our group, but also new tensions. Some, particularly Marcus and the Marshals, viewed the possibility of a treatment as a reason to attempt the journey north immediately. Others, including Dawson and the Hendersons, argued that traveling during winter conditions would be suicidal, regardless of the potential reward. I found myself caught between these positions. The scientist in me recognized the value of reaching others with greater resources and knowledge. The mountain rescue expert knew the dangers of winter travel through infected territory. The leader in me felt responsible for making a decision that would affect everyone's survival. While we deliberated, winter tightened its grip on our mountain sanctuary. Another severe storm brought temperatures well below freezing and snow deep enough to temporarily trap us in the tower. As we huddled around the inadequate stove, I studied the maps and weather patterns, calculating potential routes and risks for a northern journey. The decision would need to be made soon. Winter wouldn't last forever, and when spring arrived, the infected would likely return to full mobility. Our window of opportunity, traveling while the infected were hampered but before spring made mountain passes impassable due to melt, was narrowing daily. That night, as wind howled around our tower and snow piled against its base, I stared into the dying embers of our stove and weighed the lives of 19 people against the slim hope of finding something better beyond our mountain refuge. The tension within our group reached a breaking point in early February. What began as reasoned debate about whether to seek the research station had devolved into two distinct factions. The Marshals, Marcus, Zach, and now Howard Levitt, advocated for immediate preparation to journey north. Dawson, the Hendersons, Raymond, and several others insisted we maintain our secure position at the tower until winter fully passed. Each side had compelling arguments. The pro-journey faction pointed to our dwindling supplies, the adaptation of the fungal infection to cold, and the limited window before spring would bring increased infected activity. The stay faction emphasized the known dangers of winter travel, the uncertainty of the research station's existence, and the relative security of our current position. I called a community meeting, hoping to reach consensus rather than having to impose a decision. Everyone gathered in the main room of the tower, the mood tense as I opened the floor for discussion. Tom Marshall spoke first, having recovered from his pneumonia but still weakened. "We're slowly starving here. Our supplies won't last until spring, and game is scarce. Moving gives us a chance to find new resources along the way." Mrs. Henderson countered immediately. "Moving means exposure, to cold, to infected, to unknown territories. At least here we have shelter and a secure perimeter." The debate grew heated. Voice raised over voice. Old tensions and resentments bubbled to the surface. Kyle Marshall accused Dawson of cowardice. Raymond questioned Howard's reliability. Elena tried to mediate, but her efforts only drew fire from both sides. Then something unexpected happened. Mia, one of the college students who rarely spoke at group meetings, stood up abruptly and pulled down the collar of her sweater. There, on her shoulder, was a small red welt, the unmistakable early sign of infection. The room fell instantly silent. "I didn't want to say anything," she whispered. "I was afraid you'd make me leave." Elena immediately moved to examine her, asking when and how she might have been exposed. Mia explained through tears that during her last perimeter check, she'd fallen and cut herself on what looked like a normal plant. Only after contact did she notice the faint red tendrils running through the vegetation. Doctor, Kiyoshi confirmed what we all feared: early-stage infection. Unlike the initial outbreak, when exposure to the crimson rain caused rapid progression, this environmental transmission appeared slower. Mia had been infected for approximately 3 days, with minimal advancement of symptoms. This changed everything. The research station was no longer just a theoretical resource for our long-term survival. It represented Mia's only hope. If a treatment existed, we needed to find it quickly before her infection progressed beyond the point of potential reversal. The revelation fractured our community further. Some, particularly Raymond and the Hendersons, argued that Mia now represented a danger to the entire group and should be quarantined or even expelled. Others, led by Elena and Dr. Kiyoshi, insisted we had a moral obligation to help her, especially since her infection provided valuable information about environmental transmission. I made the decision that night after everyone else had fallen into uneasy sleep. We would split our group. I would lead a team north to locate the research station, bringing Mia and anyone who chose to come. Dawson would remain at the tower with those who preferred to stay, maintaining our secure base in case our mission failed. When I announced this plan the next morning, the response was mixed, but ultimately accepting. The compromise addressed both imperatives, seeking potential salvation while preserving our established sanctuary. The division fell largely along expected lines, with 8 choosing to travel north and 11 staying behind. Our traveling group would consist of myself, Elena, Doctor, Kiyoshi, Mia, Howard, the entire Marshall family, and, to my surprise, little Lily Chen, whose parents made the difficult decision to split up. Susan would remain at the tower where her diabetes could be more safely managed, while Robert would bring Lily north, believing the research station represented their daughter's best future. The preparations consumed the next 3 days. We gathered supplies, prepared equipment, studied maps, and developed communication protocols. Howard modified our radios to monitor for the encrypted bursts he believed came from the research station. We established recognition signals with those staying behind and agreed on calendar dates for check-ins. The night before our departure, Dawson pulled me aside. We had worked together for years before the Crimson Rain, becoming friends despite our different backgrounds. His expression was grave as he handed me a sealed envelope. "Coordinates," he explained. "A cave system about 30 miles north of here. If things go bad at the tower after you leave, we'll fall back to this position. Check there if you return and find the tower abandoned." I tucked the envelope into my pack, understanding the weight of what he was entrusting me with. We both knew the tower might not remain secure indefinitely, especially if the infected continued adapting to cold. This contingency plan might save lives if the worst happened. The morning of our departure brought clear skies and relatively mild temperatures for February. Those staying behind gathered outside the tower to see us off. There were tears, embraces, whispered promises to reunite. Susan Chen held her daughter for long minutes, whispering something in her ear that made the child nod solemnly. As we prepared to move out, I noticed Dr. Kiyoshi examining Mia's infection site one final time. His expression troubled me, concern mixed with scientific curiosity. The infection had spread visibly since its discovery, the red welt now spanning her shoulder and beginning to creep up her neck. She showed no behavioral changes yet, but her skin felt unnaturally warm around the affected area. "How long?" I asked him quietly while the others made final preparations. "At this progression rate, perhaps 2 weeks before cognitive effects begin," he replied. "Maybe 3 before full transformation. It's moving slower than direct exposure, but following the same pattern." This gave our journey urgency beyond mere survival. We were racing against Mia's transformation, with no guarantee that even if we found the research station, they would have a viable treatment. Our path would take us north along the mountain ridge for approximately 20 miles, then down through a valley and across what had once been a state highway, before climbing again into the national forest where Howard believed the research station was located. Under normal conditions, it might have been a 5-day journey. In winter, with snow and potential infected encounters, we estimated 10 days minimum. As we set out, I took point position, breaking trail through the snow for the others to follow. Behind me came Howard with his knowledge of the destination. Then the others spaced at regular intervals with Dr. Kiyoshi and Elena, flanking Mia in the middle of our column, monitoring her condition. Tom and Janet Marshall protected our rear, both now competent with rifles after months of practice. The first day passed uneventfully, our progress slower than hoped, but steady. We covered perhaps 5 miles before making camp in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines that blocked the worst of the wind. As we set up our tent shelters, I noticed Lily Chen watching Mia with intense curiosity rather than fear. Later, as we huddled around our small, carefully shielded fire, Lily asked the question the adults had been avoiding. Is Mia going to become one of the monsters? Her father tried to shush her, but Mia answered directly with remarkable composure for a college student facing such a fate. Not if we find the people who can help me. And if we can't, I might help them understand how to help others. Her courage silenced us all. Even Tom Marshall, who had been vocal about the risk of traveling with an infected person, seemed moved. In that moment, our fractured group found a unified purpose that transcended mere survival. We were now on a mission to save one of our own. As I took first watch that night, scanning our surroundings for any sign of movement against the snow, I couldn't shake a growing sense of foreboding. The infected hadn't been seen for days, not since the last major snowfall. Their absence felt strategic rather than forced, as if they were conserving energy, adapting, perhaps even planning. I studied the distant valley below us where moonlight illuminated the snow-covered landscape. For just a moment I thought I saw movement, a coordinated line of figures moving through the trees far below. But when I raised my binoculars for a better look, whatever I had glimpsed was gone, leaving only unbroken snow reflecting moonlight. The worst dangers on our journey might not be the cold, or even the infected, but the fractures within our own group. As Mia's condition progressed, difficult decisions would need to be made. I wasn't certain everyone would accept those decisions, particularly if they involved risk to others. The unity we felt tonight might prove as fragile as the ice crystals forming on our tent walls. The 5th day of our journey brought our first major setback. We had made good progress through the mountains, averaging about 6 miles per day, despite the challenging winter conditions. Our route kept us to higher elevations, where the snow was deeper but the risk of encountering infected was lower. Howard's navigation had proven reliable, confirming that his time alone in the wilderness had honed his survival skills nearly to my level. That morning, we descended into a narrow valley we needed to cross before continuing northward. The valley floor was relatively clear of snow due to the tree cover, making travel easier but visibility more limited. I took extra precautions, sending Marshall ahead to scout while the rest of us maintained a defensive formation around Mia, whose infection continued to spread slowly but steadily up her neck and across her shoulder. Marshall returned within 20 minutes, his expression grim. "Blocked," he reported. "The old Forest Service road we were planning to follow is completely impassable. Looks like a deliberate barricade of vehicles and debris." I went forward to see for myself. What I found confirmed my worst fears. The roadway was indeed blocked by an elaborate barricade constructed from abandoned vehicles, fallen trees, and metal debris. More concerning than the obstacle itself was its nature. This was not a random collection of crashed cars or storm damage. This had been built methodically, with overlapping fields of fire covering the approaches. This was a human defensive position. As I studied the barricade through binoculars, I caught movement, a glint of light reflecting off what might have been a rifle scope. Someone was watching from behind the defenses. We had two options: attempt to communicate with whoever controlled this valley passage or find another route. Given Mia's condition and our limited supplies, a lengthy detour could prove fatal. I decided to attempt contact, but with extreme caution. Using branches with strips of white fabric from a spare shirt, I created an impromptu flag of truce. Instructing the others to remain hidden with weapons ready, I moved into the open area before the barricade, holding the flag clearly visible above my head. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. Then a voice called out through a megaphone, "State your business and number." 8 travelers heading north, I replied. "We're not infected. We have a medical emergency and need passage through the valley." Another long pause followed. Finally, a different voice responded, "Approach alone to the first marker. Any weapons visible, and we open fire." The marker was a red, spray-painted line across the road about 50 yards from the main barricade. I proceeded slowly, hands visible, acute awareness of multiple weapons likely trained on me from concealed positions. When I reached the line, a figure emerged from behind the barricade, a woman in her 40s wearing mismatched military gear and carrying a shotgun. Her face was weathered with a long scar running from temple to jaw. "We don't allow large groups through," she stated flatly. "Too risky." I explained our situation: the fire tower community, the journey north to find the rumored research station, Mia's condition. I emphasized that we weren't seeking to join their community, only passage through their territory. The woman's expression hardened at the mention of Mia's infection. "You're traveling with an active infection case? Are you insane? That's an immediate execution where I come from." "It's early stage," I countered. "No behavioral changes. We're hoping to reach the research station before progression. She may be the key to understanding how to reverse the process." She studied my face, looking for deception. "Show me your hands," she demanded suddenly. I held them out, revealing my missing fingers on the left hand. "Those lost to frostbite or the infection?" "Climbing accident. Years before the crimson rain." This detail seemed to satisfy something for her. "Wait here," she instructed before retreating to the barricade. I watched as she conferred with others I couldn't see clearly. Nearly 20 minutes passed before she returned. "You can pass, but with conditions. We keep your weapons until you reach the other side of our territory. You follow our guide exactly. Any deviation, and you'll be shot. And the infected girl wears restraints." The terms were harsh, but not unreasonable given the circumstances. I returned to our group to discuss the proposal. Elena and Dr. Kiyoshi immediately objected to Mia being restrained, arguing it was degrading and unnecessary given her current condition. "If we refuse their terms, we'll need to detour at least 3 days through higher elevations," I explained. "Mia may not have that time." Howard supported me, adding that winter weather in the higher passes could trap us indefinitely. The marshals were divided, with Tom favoring the detour and Janet arguing for accepting the terms for Mia's sake. Ultimately, it was Mia herself who settled the matter. "I'll wear whatever restraints they want," she said quietly. "I understand their fear. I feel it too, every time I look at what's happening to my body." With our decision made, I returned to the barricade and accepted their terms. Shortly thereafter, a group of armed individuals emerged and efficiently collected our weapons. They provided simple but secure plastic zip-tie restraints for Mia's wrists and ankles, allowing her to walk but preventing any sudden movements. Our guide was a taciturn man who introduced himself only as Beck. As we passed through the barricade, I got my first clear view of their settlement. What had once been a small vacation community of perhaps a dozen cabins had been transformed into a fortified compound. Gardens grew in every available space, including rooftops. Children played within a fenced central area. Normal life continuing despite everything, it was both heartening and sobering to witness. Beck led us along a carefully marked path through the settlement. Residents watched us pass with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Many focused particularly on Mia, some making warding gestures or spitting on the ground as we passed. "Your friend wouldn't be allowed to live here," Beck commented without emotion. "First sign of infection, you're exiled. Second sign, you're executed. Harsh, but necessary." "Have you encountered many infected recently?" I asked, probing for information about conditions ahead. "Fewer during the cold months, but they're changing. Coming in organized groups now, testing our defenses systematically. Last week, they nearly breached the eastern perimeter. Seemed to be specifically targeting our water supply. This confirmed our observations about the infected's evolving tactics. More concerning was Beck's next revelation. The red growth is spreading faster too. Areas clear last month are contaminated now. We've had to burn sections of forest to create buffer zones." Our passage through the settlement took about 2 hours. At the northern boundary, another barricade marked their territory's end. Our weapons were returned, though I noticed the ammunition had been reduced, a precaution I might have taken myself in their position. As we prepared to continue our journey, the scarred woman from earlier approached. "The research facility you're looking for," she said quietly. "It's real. We've had radio contact, but the last transmission was 3 weeks ago, and it was fragmented. Sounded like they were under attack. This was both confirmation and warning. The station existed, but might no longer be operational. Still, it remained our best hope for Mia, and potentially for understanding how to combat the infection on a larger scale." Before departing, I asked the woman how their community had formed and survived. "Most of us were part of a wilderness survival course when the Crimson Rain fell," she explained. "Our instructor had military background, recognized the threat immediately. We secured this valley before most people understood what was happening. Been adding survivors with useful skills since then." I thanked her for allowing us passage. She nodded curtly. "If you find anything at that research station, a treatment, a vaccine, anything, come back this way. We'll shelter you." Back in the forest, beyond the settlement, we removed Mia's restraints and resumed our previous formation. The day's delay meant pushing harder through the afternoon and evening to maintain our schedule. The temperature dropped as the sun began to set, reminding us that winter still held these mountains firmly in its grip. That evening, as we made camp, Howard managed to detect a faint signal on his modified radio, a brief burst of encoded data. He couldn't decrypt it, but the transmission pattern matched what he believed came from the research station. "Signal's stronger," he confirmed. "We're heading in the right direction. Maybe 2-3 days away if we maintain pace." Dr. Kiyoshi performed his daily examination of Mia's infection site. The crimson growth had spread further, now reaching the base of her skull and beginning to extend down her arm. More concerning was the slight hardening of the affected skin, the beginning of the shell-like structure we'd observed in later stage infected. "Any symptoms?" he asked her. "Headaches? Unusual thoughts? Sensory changes?" Mia hesitated before answering. "Sometimes I hear something, like whispers just below hearing range, and colors seem different. Reds are more vibrant, almost glowing." Elena and Dr. Kiyoshi exchanged worried glances. These were new symptoms, not previously documented in our observations of the infected. Usually, the progression moved from physical changes to sudden behavioral shifts without an intermediate stage of altered perception. You need to tell us immediately if these symptoms intensify, Elena instructed, particularly if you begin to feel urges or impulses that don't seem like your own. Mia nodded solemnly. I will. I promise. That night, I took first watch again, positioning myself on a small rise overlooking our campsite and the valley we'd passed through. The settlement's lights were just visible in the distance, tiny pinpoints of human resistance against the darkness. As I scanned our surroundings, something caught my attention. A pattern of movement in the forest to our east. Not the random wandering of wildlife, but deliberate, coordinated motion. Through my binoculars, I could make out shadowy figures moving parallel to our position, just beyond clear visibility. I didn't alert the others immediately, not wanting to cause panic. Instead, I watched, counting at least 7 distinct figures maintaining perfect pace with each other, never breaking formation. They didn't approach our camp but seemed to be observing, perhaps even escorting us. The behavior was unlike anything I'd previously observed from the infected. When Howard relieved me for the second watch, I shared what I'd seen. His expression darkened. They're not just adapting to the cold, he murmured. They're adapting to us, learning, watching, planning. I didn't sleep well after that, my dreams filled with crimson tendrils reaching through snow, forming patterns too complex for coincidence, but too alien to comprehend. In the morning, I found fresh tracks circling our entire campsite, a perfect perimeter laid down while we slept, as if marking our position for something to follow. Our 8th day brought the first real sign that our journey might not be in vain. As we crested a ridge overlooking a small valley, Howard's radio picked up a stronger signal. No longer just encoded bursts, but actual voice transmission, though heavily distorted by static. This is CDC Outpost 7, the transmission crackled. Broadcasting on emergency frequencies. Any survivors with medical or scientific training are directed to our location. We are researching countermeasures against the crimson pathogen. The message repeated twice before fading back to static. Howard worked frantically to capture the coordinates embedded in the transmission. His face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen since his arrival at our tower. Got it, he said triumphantly. They're in an old FEMA bunker about 5 miles northwest of our position. 5 miles in normal conditions would be a few hours' walk. In our current situation, deep snow, difficult terrain, Mia's deteriorating condition, it would likely take us most of a day. We abandoned our planned camp and pushed forward immediately, new energy flowing through our exhausted group. Mia needed the boost in morale more than anyone. The infection had progressed significantly overnight. The crimson growth now covered most of her shoulder and neck, with tendrils extending across her collarbone and up to her jawline. The skin had hardened into the shell-like carapace characteristic of advanced infection. More concerning were her cognitive symptoms, periods of disorientation, sensitivity to light, and what she described as voices just at the edge of hearing. Dr. Kiyoshi no longer attempted to hide his concern. We need to reach the facility within 24 hours, he told me privately as we hiked. After that, I can't guarantee she'll remain herself. The terrain grew more challenging as we approached the coordinates. Steep ravines, dense forest, areas where the snow had partially melted and refrozen into treacherous ice sheets. I took point, using my climbing experience to secure paths for the others to follow. The physical exertion kept my mind focused, but couldn't entirely dispel the sense that we were being watched. Late in the afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the snow, Howard's radio picked up another transmission. Clearer this time, with what sounded like specific instructions. The voice directed survivors to approach from the Western Access Road, where a checkpoint had been established to screen newcomers. We altered our course accordingly, following what had once been a maintenance road, but was now barely distinguishable beneath the snow. As we rounded a bend, I raised my hand, signaling everyone to stop. Ahead, perhaps half a mile distant, stood a concrete structure partially embedded in the mountainside, the FEMA bunker surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter despite the daylight, and I could make out figures moving along a walkway near the entrance. "We made it," Elena whispered, relief evident in her voice. I wasn't ready to celebrate yet. Something felt wrong about the scene before us. The movements of the figures patrolling the perimeter seemed too uniform, too coordinated. And where was the checkpoint mentioned in the transmission? Before I could voice my concerns, Mia suddenly collapsed, her body convulsing. Dr. Kiyoshi and Elena rushed to her side while the rest of us formed a protective circle around them. Her eyes had rolled back, showing only whites, and the crimson tendrils on her neck pulsed with an internal light. "She's accelerating," Dr. Kiyoshi said urgently. "The proximity to the bunker might be triggering it. Or whatever was inside the bunker might be recognizing one of its own," I thought, but didn't say. Howard's radio crackled to life again, the voice clearer than ever. "Approaching survivors, be advised. The facility has been compromised. Do not attempt entry through main access. Repeat, facility compromised." We all looked toward the bunker, now understanding what we were seeing. Those weren't CDC personnel patrolling the perimeter. They were infected, monitors based on their coordinated movements. The transmission hadn't been directing us to safety. It had been warning us away. As this realization sank in, Mia's convulsions stopped. She sat up slowly, her movements unnaturally fluid. When she opened her eyes, the irises had taken on a crimson tint. She smiled at us, but the expression contained none of the college student's former warmth. "They're waiting for us," she said in a voice that was hers, but somehow not hers. "They've been waiting all along."